Welcome, everyone, to our third seminar in legal philosophy between state and transnationalism of the term. I have the honors today of introducing our guest speaker, who's probably familiar to most of us, if not all of us, but deserves an introduction none the same. Professor Louis-Philippe Hodgson earned his PhD in philosophy from Harvard in 2006. He teaches and researches in philosophy of law, moral and political philosophy, Kant's practical philosophy, the history of moral and political philosophy with a focus on social contract theory. He has published articles in several prestigious philosophy journals and legal theory journals, including the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, Legal Theory, and Ethics. And his paper today is Reproductive Choices and Distributive Justice, a Problem for Globalism.
Thank you, Mike. It's very nice to be here and to be on this side of the podium. So I'm assuming that many of you have read the paper, but I was told that I should give a long presentation anyway, so I'm going to do that. So the paper starts from, I'm interested in a disagreement that is at the heart of a lot of questions in global justice right now. It's a disagreement between people who think that we have the same obligations towards all human beings, wherever they might be. So we have the same obligations toward human beings as such, regardless of what country they live in, where they were born, and so on. And people who think that we have stronger obligations towards people who are fellow citizens. So the main contrast is a contrast between people I call globalists. Globalists believe that sharing political institutions, being citizens of the same country, has at most a pragmatic importance. So at most it means that it's easier to fulfill our obligations towards certain people, and so maybe that's what we should do for efficiency reasons. But there's no principled reason why we would have different duties towards our fellow citizens than towards people in other countries. And I want to contrast globalism with what I call statism. Statism is a view sort of at the other extreme of the spectrum. It's the view that we have minimal obligations towards human beings as such. So we have minimal obligations of distributive justice towards everyone in all countries. But our strongest duties of distributive justice, what I call our duties of equality, only obtain towards fellow citizens. So a lot of the recent literature on distributive justice has to do in some way or other with this disagreement. And it's interesting to note that globalism seems to be the dominant position right now, certainly in terms of number of adherents. I don't know in terms of who's winning the debates, but it's become something of a default position. And it's interesting because it's not the view that people hold, or at least that people seem to hold in their everyday lives. We certainly don't live by the principles of globalism. It's a deeply revisionist view. It's a view that suggests that we have much stronger obligations towards people in other countries than we seem to assume that we have. So what I'm interested in specifically is what I take to be the argument that pushes people towards globalism, the argument that explains why globalism has become something of a default position. I call that argument the argument from the moral arbitrariness of birthplace. The argument is extremely familiar. I think anyone who's taken a class on global justice has encountered the argument. It goes something like what follows. We start from the idea that we should ensure at the domestic level that factors such as social class or innate talent don't determine people's life prospects because, this is the key phrase, which is borrowed from Rawls, these factors are arbitrary from a moral point of view. So that's the starting point. We shouldn't let social class determine people's life prospects, say, because it's arbitrary from a moral point of view. Then there's the crucial observation, which is a person's country of birth seems to be just as morally arbitrary as a person's class of birth. there's this analogy here. And then the conclusion seems to be that we shouldn't allow a person's country of birth to determine her life prospects. And of course, this suggests that our duties of distributive justice are the same towards all people, because otherwise we're allowing the country of birth to determine the person's life prospects. So the argument is meant to show that, as in, to quote Simon Caney, an inescapable implication of our domestic commitments, statism just can't be true. If you're a progressive liberal at the domestic level, you have to be a globalist at the international level. Now, to be precise, this isn't meant to be a conclusive argument for globalism. I think it's best understood as a challenge for statists. The challenge is statists have to tell us what explains, what makes a person's birthplace non-arbitrary from a moral point of view. They have to tell us why it's okay for that to play a role in our reasoning about justice. And if they can't, then they should just become, they should convert, they should become globalists. Now there's a significant literature on this topic. There are statists who try to show, for instance, that the kind of coercion that goes on within the state explains why sharing political institutions is relevant to duties of distributive justice. There are also some who want to show that the kind of cooperation that goes on within the state has a special relevance that, again, explains why we would have stronger duties towards fellow citizens. But I think it's fair to say that nobody has presented an argument that has convinced the field. Certainly, I don't think statists have converted a lot of globalists with these arguments. So what I try to do in the paper is to adopt a different angle. I try to show that if you adopt the globalist perspective and you throw in certain relatively obvious facts about human reproduction, then you run into a problem about what I call the unilateral imposition of duties. So in a nutshell, my thought is that the globalist argument, this argument from the moral arbitrariness of birthplace, only focuses on the life prospects of newborns, but it doesn't at all take account of the fact that people don't just appear in our midst, they're born as the result of other people's reproductive choices. And so once we take account of this fuller picture, I suggest, there's a problem that arises about whether one person's reproductive choices should be allowed to impact the duties of other people. I suggest that solving this problem is more complicated than it looks. And ultimately, I think it requires political institutions. So the main idea is reproductive choices, on a globalist view, lead to the imposition of duties on others. I think that that's problematic. And I think that the way this problem normally gets addressed is through the presence of political institutions. And so, sorry, the implication is we relate differently to the reproductive choices of our fellow citizens than we do to the reproductive choices of people in other countries. Very briefly, to fix ideas, I'll be assuming, so there are these two kinds of duties that are at play here. They're what I call duties of humanitarian aid, which are assumed to be owed to everyone, regardless of where they are. They're minimal duties. And then there are more ambitious duties, more stringent duties, that are usually called duties of equality. I'll assume here a specific content for duties of equality because it makes things easier. I'll just assume that duties of equality demand that we equalize the life prospects of children. That's, it's an overly simple conception of the duty probably, but it's close enough to what a lot of globalists say, and it will allow us to think about what this would mean exactly. But I think that the argument I present would also work on any number of other articulation of that duties. Okay. Let me say quickly a couple of things about appeals to moral arbitrariness, because that's a big part of what fuels the argument that globalists present. it's common for philosophers to claim that the idea that we should eradicate morally arbitrary features, or to put it more precisely, that we shouldn't let morally arbitrary factors make a difference to people's life prospects, goes back to John Rawls. Famously, in Theory of Justice, when Rawls considers libertarianism as a potential alternative to his view, he criticizes libertarianism because it allows natural talents and social class to make too much of a difference to people's prospects. And he says it permits distributive shares to be improperly influenced by these factors so arbitrary from a moral point of view. And then Rawls also throws in another idea, which is that we should be especially concerned with the life prospects of children. Roughly, the idea is there are deep inequalities in people's starting places in life. And as he put it, they cannot possibly be justified by an appeal to the notions of merit or desert. And so people have put these two ideas together and thought, oh, we have this great powerful argument in Rawls. The argument is we should not allow morally arbitrary factors to make a difference to people's life prospects. And when you're born, everything is morally arbitrary because you haven't made any choices yet. There's nothing, no merit, no desert, no responsibility. Nothing could make any factor not morally arbitrary. So this has been seen as a particularly potent weapon for liberals. It's a good way to argue against conservative views, for instance. You could say, well, you entrench all these inequalities. How could these be justified from the point of view of someone who was just born? Now, I want to note here that Rawls himself is very careful in his appeal to moral arbitrariness. It doesn't play that big a role in his argument. It actually just appears, I think, once in the entire book. And certainly Rawls doesn't think that the goal of social justice is to eradicate moral arbitrariness wherever it might be found. He also doesn't seem to think, and this is the point I want to stress, that it's a fundamental consideration in his theory of justice. It's one consideration that he brings up, but it's not, the argument for moral arbitrariness isn't supposed to be his final argument against libertarianism. That argument has to take place in the original position. So it's meant to be one consideration that's brought up in the course of, a characteristically long and convoluted argument that Rawls presents. So what I want to stress is globalists make a more full-blooded use of the idea of moral arbitrariness. That is, they rely on the idea that appeals to moral arbitrariness can ground definitive conclusions. We can make judgments about what's morally arbitrary, and from that derive views about what justice demands. So this makes globalism closely aligned with a view that's been remarkably influential in political philosophy, given how radical and strange it is, namely Locke egalitarianism. So on a Locke egalitarian view, appeals to moral arbitrariness are not just intuitive considerations, they're not just placeholders for what our best theory of justice may eventually establish or something like that. On a Locke egalitarian view, these appeals have a definite content. They have a specific theory of what constitutes moral arbitrariness, and that's, if you want, the input of their theory of justice. It's not, there's nothing provisional about invoking moral arbitrariness in this context. Now, I mostly want to bring up the contrast with Locke egalitarianism because I want to start by saying that globalism is in a lot of ways a more modest view than Locke egalitarianism. That is, to be a globalist, you don't have to be a full-on Locke egalitarian. You don't have to think that moral arbitrariness should be eradicated wherever it is. You don't have to think that we have a systematic account of moral arbitrariness that can apply to the entire range of human choice, which is, as far as I can tell, what Locke egalitarians think. I think you could be quite a modest, you could make a modest appeal to the idea of moral arbitrariness in something like the following way. You could think, well, look, we don't necessarily have a fully worked out theory of what should count as moral arbitrary. But in some cases, we know that certain factors shouldn't affect a person's lot in life. So for instance, we know that it should not turn out that a person's race, can make a difference to her life prospects. We're as certain of that as we are of anything else in our theory of justice. Nothing is going to make us revise that. So there are some appeals to moral arbitrariness that are quite solid. And a globalist could say, a person's country of birth is like that. It's one of the appeals that we can be quite certain about. We don't see how that could be a legitimate source of inequality. And I mean, there is something to be said for this. For one thing, inequalities tied to birthplace are some of the most egregious inequalities in our world. It's bad to be born in one of the lower social classes in a rich country, but in a lot of ways, it's much worse to be born in a poor country. It determines people's life prospects much more at a much deeper level. So I think there is a real worry that globalists are putting forward. And I don't think that the use they make of the idea of moral arbitrariness is that implausible. So I think some of the uses made in Locke egalitarianism quickly get a bit fanciful and hard to take seriously. I don't think that's the case necessarily for globalism. But I still think that the argument runs into problems. And I now want to say a couple of words about that. So the thing to note is, if you think that by comparing the life prospects of two children in different countries, you can draw conclusions about what justice demands, then you're not just assuming that the life prospects of children matter. Everybody thinks that. What you're assuming is that no other factor needs to be taken into account to decide what justice demands, which is a much more debatable claim. So I think the general way to tackle the globalist viewpoint, or at least the most obvious way to do it, is to show that their picture is incomplete, to show that there's something that they're not taking into account. I think in a way that's Rawls's approach in the Law of Peoples. He presents this argument in the Law of Peoples, which is meant to show that you could have significant differences of wealth between two countries, and yet no question of justice arise. He imagines two countries that have very different policies as to whether they're going to go in a more industrial direction or whether they're going to favor a more, as he puts it, pastoral and leisurely lifestyle. And so we have two countries. One of them decides we should really industrialize, we should invest in our industry and so on. And the other one says, well, we should invest in our industry a little bit, but really we want to preserve this traditional lifestyle that we have. It's very good for us. And then Rawls says we can assume that as a result of these different choices, the two countries end up being in very different places. So one of them becomes much richer than the other. And I think what Rawls wants to say is the following. It seems plausible that each course is a perfectly acceptable course for a country to take. It's acceptable for a country to decide to industrialize massively. It's acceptable for a country to choose to industrialize on a smaller scale. That's going to create differences in the life prospects of individuals born in each country. But those differences aren't a problem from the point of view of justice. They're just differences. And so the lesson to draw would be we can't just focus on the life prospects of children. We have to look at the other factors, such as what decisions were made by the countries. Now, I think this is, I actually really like Rawls's argument. I think there's a lot to be said for it. It doesn't usually convince globalists, because once you're in the grip of the moral arbitrariness of birthplace view, you're going to think that whether you're born in a country that made certain decisions is itself a morally arbitrary fact about you. You didn't have a say in those decisions. You didn't decide to industrialize or not. And so if you're really worse off, and I should insist, we have to assume that the people born in one of the two societies, and you can pick which one depending on what lifestyle attracts you more, but we have to assume that people born in one of the two countries are worse off than the others. There's a significant difference here. So globalists would say that difference is morally arbitrary. It's not based on any choices that children made. It's not legitimized by anything about the children themselves. So the moral arbitrariness argument has this feature that it's very good at attacking counter-arguments. Whatever you bring up is going to be itself presented as morally arbitrary because it's not going to be something that the children did. So I want to present a more direct argument against globalism. I want to assume that globalists are right. And I want to show that it leads us to highly improbable conclusions. So assume that globalists are right. Assume that any child born anywhere is owed the equalization of its life prospects with those of children everywhere else. This places a very stringent requirement on the rest of us. And I think that there's a question about how this requirement can be imposed on us. Specifically, I think there's a question about how the reproductive choices of people in other countries could lead to this requirement applying to us. Start by considering the following case. As a rule, we think that we have the power to create moral obligations for ourselves. But we're much less sure about the power to create moral obligations for others. At least our practice of promising suggests something like that, right? I can promise to cut your hair, and if you accept, then I have an obligation to cut your hair. I've created that obligation, and I can do that for any number of things. But I can't promise you that Jake will cut your hair. That's not a valid promise. I don't have that within my normative power. I can't create obligations for others in this way. So that suggests that in addition to having an interest in granting other people certain rights over our actions, which is what we do by promising, we have an interest in being able to control when and in what respect we become obligated to do something. Scanlon, in his discussion of promising, suggests that if coerced promises were binding, then agents wouldn't have, quote, sufficient opportunity to avoid unwanted obligations. I think the same would be true if we could make promises on other people's behalf. We wouldn't have sufficient opportunity to avoid unwanted obligations. Now, I think it's striking that reproductive choices aren't similarly restricted in their normative impact. Now, of course, choosing to have a child is by far the best way to create obligations for yourself, right? If you're into creating obligations for yourself and you've only been making promises, you're really missing out. Or so I'm told. Like, that's not, go nuclear, have a child. But the striking thing for our purposes is that it's also a shockingly good way to create obligations for other people. If I have a child and then I'm unable, or even if I just fail, even if I don't feel like taking care of it, others are on the line. And they can't get off just by saying that they didn't choose to have the child, or by saying that they didn't have sufficient opportunity to avoid this unwanted obligation. The obligation is just there. I think this makes human reproduction a peculiar phenomenon, morally speaking. It seems that reproductive choices can lead to the creation of obligations for others without any input on their part. So a strictly unilateral creation of obligation. Now, of course, you may think that all sorts of choices do that, but I think there are peculiar features in the case of reproductive choices. Right? Suppose I climb a dangerous mountain. It's true that if it doesn't go well, then I've somehow created a duty for others to help me. But whether others have to help me, on most views at least, depends on whether my choice to climb the mountain was a wise choice, whether I was warned, and a number of other things. So there is a sort of sensitivity to the choices I made in the duties that are created for others. One thing that's interesting about reproductive choices is that you don't have that sensitivity at all. It doesn't matter how foolish or ill-advised a person's choice to have children is. In fact, even if somebody chooses to have children just to create obligations for others, it succeeds. It's sort of the one way you can do that, right? If you choose to climb a mountain just to force others to rescue you, I mean, that really discounts your claim to being helped. But not so in the case of children. And I take it that the explanation is that when we have children, we bring into the world a new source of obligation. So there's a moral significance to the choice, but once the child exists, it's a separate source of obligation, right? It's not responsible for anything I did. It's not responsible for my sins. And so whatever my failings, it gets a blank slate. It just starts, it starts anew. So I think that reproductive choices are tied to quite a remarkable normative power, a remarkably unrestricted normative power. So how worrying that is, I think, depends on what kind of obligation you think is created when we bring a new person into the world. I think that this is an important part of my claim here, right? If you thought that all we owe to the children of other people are negative duties, it's just like we can't kill or torture them, then there really wouldn't be much of a worry, because if you have a duty not to kill or torture people, the fact that more people are brought into existence doesn't make any new demands on you. If you can't go around torturing people, that's the same demand whether there are 5 people or 1 million. But if you have a positive duty, if you have a positive obligation to help others, then it does seem to make a difference how many people are brought into existence. If somebody brings into existence a new being that you're on the line to help, that makes a difference to your obligations. It's an obligation that I think, again, to use Scanlon's phrase, you could reasonably want to have sufficient opportunity to avoid. Now, it's quite possible that in some ways I'm hitting my head against the walls of our cage here. You may think, well, we all enter the world in a hopelessly vulnerable state. It's not like it's that surprising if that has to factor into our moral deliberation, and it's not that surprising if that ends up creating obligations for us. Maybe there's something to the idea that we were all in this vulnerable stage at some point, and now we have to care for others and so on. Maybe that's true. But even if that's true, I don't think that it addresses the specific worry that arises in the context of globalism. So as I understand them, globalists aren't just making a claim about my moral obligations. They're not just saying that I have this imperfect duty to help children everywhere or something like that. I take them to be making a claim about my enforceable obligations, at the very least in the sense that they think that the state is justified in taxing me to make me fulfill these positive duties I have. I think this adds a significant dimension to the problem. The implication is that through my reproductive choices, I can make it the case that others have enforceable obligations of distributive justice towards new persons. I can make it the case, if you want, that the state is justified in forcing others to do something. I think this idea, this would mean that I would have a disturbing kind of control over the normative situation of others. Now, it's a limited control, of course. We're not saying that other people's enforceable obligations are limitless. And we are saying that they're mediated by the state in some ways. But I still get to trigger them in a way that seems completely unilateral. Now, let me be precise about the claim I'm making, because I know this is not making me sound like a great person. Once again, I'm not denying that we have some enforceable obligations towards everyone. I think to deny that would be to strike the wrong balance between my interest in avoiding having obligations imposed on me and of course, poor children's interest in having their basic needs met. But I think that's why it's so plausible to think that there's this distinction between duties of humanitarian aid and duties of equality. It seems plausible to say, I have duties of humanitarian aid towards everyone everywhere. But if you say that our most stringent duties of distributive justice extend to everyone, then what you're saying is that the worry about unilateral imposition makes no difference at all to the content of our duties of distributive justice. And that's what I think is implausible. So what makes this moderate statist position that differentiates duties of humanitarian aid and duties of equality plausible to me is the fact that it recognizes that there are two different contexts here, and it's plausible to think that in one of the two contexts, obligations are more stringent. Because, and of course this gets me to an important idea, because the thought would be, in the domestic context, the problem of unilateral imposition can be somehow addressed. This has to be part of what makes this relevant to the disagreement, right? So the worry about unilateral imposition could make plausible the picture that we have more stringent duties towards our fellow citizens if that worry is somehow addressed at the domestic level and can't be at the international level. Let me see. How much longer should I speak? 10
minutes.
10 minutes is good? Yeah. Okay. So very briefly, I think that, let me say why I don't think that it's plausible that we can solve the problem without political institutions, and then I'll say how I think political institutions can address the problem. And then if I have time, I'll express some conclusive or concluding thoughts about this. So the reason why I don't think the problem can be solved outside the state is that the kinds of solution to worries about unilateral imposition that have been suggested independently of the state just don't apply in our present case. I think the most, certainly the most illustrious and a helpful example of this kind of theory is Locke's theory of acquisition. The problem of acquisition has common features with the problem that I'm raising here, right? It's a worry that by doing certain things, say by investing my labor in an object, I can create obligations for everybody else. Right, so on a classical theory of acquisition, I can do something independently of anybody else is having a say, and then suddenly everybody has an obligation not to use the object without my consent. And there's this question, how can I have the power to change other people's normative situation in this way? Now, Locke is he's the most prominent philosopher who has, or at least in the tradition, who has defended a solution to this problem that doesn't invoke the state at all. I think it's important to know that the kinds of suggestions he makes don't apply to the kind of problem I'm raising for very obvious reasons. Locke considers two ways to solve the problem of acquisition, really. One he dismisses pretty quickly because he doesn't think it can work. So the first solution is to address the worry about unilateralism. You say unilateral imposition of obligations seems problematic. Let's not make them not unilateral. Let's get everybody's consent. And of course, Locke famously says, well, we can't do that. That's not workable. You can't actually have everybody's consent. If we had tried that, we would have all starved. So we need a different way of doing it. So then Locke, instead of worrying about the unilateral aspect of the imposition, worries about its burdensomeness. Is the imposition burdensome? Does it make others worse off? And this, of course, is what leads him to his famous proviso. His idea is, if there's a proviso on acquisition that ensures that when I acquire an object, nobody is made worse off by it, then there's no worry about the unilateral imposition of obligations. No one can complain, seems to be Locke's thought. You haven't made anybody worse off, so nobody can complain. Now, clearly, neither of these two solutions can work in our case. The first one can't work for the same reasons that Locke said. It's not feasible to get everybody's consent every time you want to have a child. It would also be particularly humiliating to have to ask everyone for their consent before you could have a child. So there's many reasons why we don't want that kind of solution. But also, the proviso isn't applicable to our situation at all, right? Because we're saying the cases we're interested in are cases in which others are not left in as good a position by one person's having a child. It's cases in which there is a cost created for others. And so clearly we can't just say we're going to worry only about the burdensomeness of the obligation. That's sort of built into our problem. So even if you think that Locke is right about property, even if you think that acquisition could be fully legitimate in a state of nature, there's still a problem that arises here. If globalists are right about our obligations of distributive justice, then reproductive choices create unilateral obligations that can't plausibly be made good by Lockean considerations. So even Lockeans have to agree that we need a different solution. So what I think we need is something more like a Kantian solution, or the kind of solution that Kant presents in his discussion of property. And on this kind of approach, don't worry, I'm not going to get into the details of Kant for those of you who are scared of that stuff. But the crucial idea for Kant, I think, and I think it's an idea that we can accept from all sorts of other points of view, is that what should really worry us is not the burdensomeness in the sort of Lockean sense of creating, making others worse off or closing off options or something like that. What we should be worried about is the very idea that one person can have the power to change the enforceable obligations of another. That's what the fundamental worry is for Kant. And I take it that for Kant, such a power is incompatible with this idea that we should be mutually independent, the idea that I shouldn't get to decide for you, you shouldn't get to decide for me. Now, because he focuses on the unilateral character of the imposition, Kant's solution is relatively simple. He says, well, what we need to do is to make the imposition somehow reciprocal. And the way it's done is, I think, by having the exercise of the power be mediated by appropriate political institutions. Now, that's a program that a lot of people can get on board with. The way Kant understands it more specifically is tricky, and I don't think he's terribly helpful at giving us the details of how this is supposed to go. But the idea I want to take from him is this idea that we want the obligations we create for one another to be mediated by something like a common decision. Well, Kant would say we want it to be to stem from the general will or something like that. And then there's all these questions about how we want to understand that. But I think the intuitive idea is that we want the decisions to be mediated by something that counts as a common decision. And I think the idea I want to put forward is that I think we can do this if the obligations we create for each other are mediated by institutional arrangements that are suitably responsive to what we can ask of each other. And the thought is, we don't have obligations like that at the international level. We do at the domestic level. And so that's why obligations end up being different. OK, let me say a little bit more about how I think this goes exactly. So mostly so far, I've emphasized what I call the problem of unilateral imposition, because I think that that's the problem that we don't think about when we talk about reproductive choices. But of course, there's another important consideration that is the one that we do think about when we think about reproductive choices, namely the fact that these are very important choices. These are choices that we want people to be able to make without constant state interference and so on. So there's a worry about unilateral imposition on the one side, and then on the other side there's a worry about what you might call reproductive privacy. And what we need is a way to reconcile these two types of consideration. And this is where I want to introduce Rawls's idea of pure procedural justice. This is where I think this idea is actually sort of tailor-made for this kind of problem. Because what we need is a system that allows individuals to make their own choices without undue interference, but that guarantees that the joint outcome of these choices will be acceptable to everybody. So in a nutshell, the idea of pure procedural justice is the idea that it's the idea of a system in which justice is determined by the actual carrying out of a procedure. Very famously, Rawls's example is a series of fair gambles. If we spend the evening playing poker together and we all play without cheating, then whatever money we each have at the end of the evening is the money we're entitled to, right? The procedure bestows fairness, if you want, on its outcome. Now, in the context of Rawls's theory, the idea of pure procedural justice plays a very important role, among other things because it provides an answer to a kind of worry that Nozick formulated after the book came out. And Nozick, the worry was addressed preemptively in the book, I guess. It's this worry that an egalitarian state has to constantly intervene in the lives of its citizens. Nozick has this famous formula that the state has to restrict capitalist acts between consenting adults. I take it what he wants to conjure up is this image that you're trying to exchange goods with a neighbor or something like that. You're trying to sell something, and then the state knocks on the door and says, "Oh, you have to pay a certain amount to me now." The idea of pure procedural justice is meant to ensure that this isn't how things would go in a Rawlsian society, right? The idea is we set up the rules, and then we announce them publicly. People know what the rules are. They can create expectations in light of the rules, and then they make their choices within the rules. It's just that we've chosen rules that ensure that the result will stay acceptable to everybody. And I think if there's one area in which this kind of model is attractive, it would be the area of reproductive choices, right? That's an area in which we don't want to be constantly interfering in people's lives, telling them what they can and can't do unpredictably. What we want to do is set up rules that are announced in advance. People know what they are. People know what cost they have to bear and so on. And then they can make their choices in light of these rules. And I think that this is basically what states do, or at least what states that have the sort of bureaucratic wherewithal do. They have population policies. What they do is they put in place incentives that aim ideally to ensure that the aggregate decisions of people concerning reproductive matters end up being in the interest of everybody. So I think for the most part, this is the form that pure procedural justice would take in the context of reproductive choices. And the key idea is this is, I claim, this is something that states can do, and this is something that we don't have anything to do at the international level. And so that's what creates the relevant difference. Now, what exactly it means for the results to be acceptable to all is, of course, a difficult question. But I think there are two things on which we're likely to agree. One is that there's a certain range within which we want the birth rate to be. Right? So if our institutions, and in particular our very important pension system, is to continue operating, so if we're to continue to have social justice, we need the birth rate to fall in a certain range. So that's a first idea that has to be part of what makes it acceptable to all. And then I think it's very plausible to think that within the range, so there's still room for decision making, I think democratic decision making can push towards one end of the range or the other. So as long as we're within the range that allows us to stay just, it's okay to say we want to go for the more pastoral lifestyle or the more industrial. It's okay to say we want to push for more growth, more population growth, or And I think these two ideas together are that's the most plausible conception we have of what would be a mediation by a common decision. And so I think that the best conception we have of what counts as a common decision is a decision in accordance with democratic procedure that is guided by a range determined by considerations of justice. A couple of precision. Sorry, I'm running over a little bit. So one thing is, what really matters, on my view, is not whether we have a muscular population policy in place or not. You know, most developed societies have very barely noticeable population policies. You know, they have a few tax incentives, maybe they have subsidized daycare, but that's usually the extent of it. But what really matters here isn't so much the content of the policy. It's the fact that there are institutions in place that have the power and the bureaucratic apparatus to take the measures that are required. So the thought is, it's not so much whether there's a strong policy in place that determines the mediation. It's the institutional framework that is there to ensure some kind of responsiveness to the interests of everybody. And I think that's what is clearly missing in the case of at the international level, where there are no global institutions that have either the power or the mandate to put in place a worldwide population policy. There are countries that have reasonable population policies in place, and that is some kind of approximation of the ideal, and that may make a difference to how we understand our obligations to this country. But you don't make obligations reciprocal by just having one party decide unilaterally that they're going to do what they should be doing. You need actual institutions for that. Now, what the institutions would have to look like at the global level is a difficult question, but 2 points I make in the paper. One is that they would have to be supranational, institutions, right? They couldn't just be the existing states. They would have to be institutions that represent people in different countries in some kind of suitable way. So it would have to be a new institutional apparatus. And then the other is, so there would be the same issue as at the domestic level. That is, we would want the institutions to ensure that the birth rate across countries stays within a range that's compatible with the demands of justice. But also, presumably, we would want these institutions to be democratically accountable in some ways. Although what that means at the international level is probably much less demanding than what it means at the local level. But there would have to be some kind of responsiveness to people. In any case, I think it's clear that what we're talking about is an ideal that we don't have at all in the current international order. So I think that that's a very significant difference between the domestic and the international level. Should I just leave it there? I have
maybe a conversation if you want to bring up other aspects, or do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I have another section, but
And that's the one you said you wanted comments on.
It's true.
In the paper. So.
Well, it's the one I'm less certain about. So this is where I start saying things I mean, no, that's not true. I started a long time ago saying things I wasn't sure about. But
do you want to expose yourself to devastating criticisms on our part?
Well, but I should, right? Isn't that the whole? Okay, I'll just do it very quickly. And so I've argued that it's not plausible to think that a person's imposing enforceable obligations on another person is a completely unproblematic thing. And I've argued that it makes a big difference whether you have institutions that mediate these obligations or not, and that we don't have these institutions at the international level. Now, what I want to stress in concluding is I don't necessarily think that the right conclusion to derive from this is that we have very weak obligations towards people in other countries, and that's the end of it. I think it's more plausible to think that what all these considerations show is that we all human beings across the globe, we face a problem about how to make our reproductive choices acceptable to one another, how to make them suitably reciprocal. And the solution to that problem isn't to say, well, we don't have the institutions that could solve that problem, so we don't have the obligations that would come with that, those institutions. The right solution is to say, well, we should put in place those institutions. Now, I think that the way we think about things, it may be one of these cases where thinking in terms of ideal and non-ideal theory is useful. As a matter of ideal theory, the demand is to put in place the institutions that would make the obligations reciprocal. And ideal theory doesn't tell us what our obligations are now because we're in a non-ideal situation. So in our situation, we think in terms of non-ideal theory, and this is where we bring in the distinction between the duties of humanitarian aid and the duties of equality. But that's not really a way of solving the problem completely. It's a way of addressing the problem as best we can, given that the ideal seems to be out of reach. So I don't think the implications of the paper are as conservative as they may otherwise seem. I think the implication is we need to have a different international set of institutions, and then our obligations towards one another will be made reciprocal. All right, I'll really stop there. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now open up for questions. Garrett, you had a...
I'd like to start by saying thank you. I enjoyed the paper. But I'm wondering about this sort of this range that you speak of in the population policy. And you seem to talk about incentives, assuming that the population policy is going to be below. But what about when the population policy is dealing with a situation in which it's above, right? So in our ideal theory, do we want to then say that, while it's fine we can incentivize it at the domestic level, we may also want to then curb it back or prohibit it at the domestic level as well? And, we might want to say that there are the one-child policy, for instance, in China is one example where we want to pull it back. And that seems to butt up against the democratic, at least, insofar as, I want a child. In fact, a lot of us want a child. And so why can't we just go ahead and have more children? And whether or not, when we get to that critical point, if we have a whole bunch of sort of an arms race amongst octomoms, and they want to have 8 kids, and they want to continuously have 8 kids, and that's going to then bring us to the other end of the spectrum. And I'm wondering whether or not you can address that, because it seems like you didn't address it in the paper, insofar as where that range. How would we deal with the range on the other side of the spectrum as opposed to just the incentivized? And is it acceptable?
So your worry, I take it, is the policy starts looking much more worrying when you're thinking of curbing population growth rather than encouraging it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it does,
thought?
because I do think that there's some sort of obligations not to have too many children. But if we're talking about it as placing obligations on others by how many children we have, then I think it sort of opens the question about whether or not we can say to those preemptively, look, you just can't have that many kids because you're putting too much obligation on the rest of us, A, and B, you're going to bring the population spectrum above what it needs to be sustainable, right? You're bringing us as opposed to below. I think the below issue as incentives makes sense, but on the other side of the table, it also makes sense to say to curb it back. And I don't know if that's going to butt up against your democracy as being another aspect of this.
Well, I'm more worried about, I don't know if it's the democracy aspect or
the privacy.
The privacy, yeah. It's the privacy worry. And I think the privacy worry is very strong. Mm-hmm. And I think we're right to be suspicious of policies that are too draconian, as the Chinese policy might have been. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think sometimes we're maybe a bit naive when we think about reproductive choices. I mean, overpopulation can be a very serious problem, right?
No, it can.
And obviously in Canada, it's not our first problem, but the idea that countries like India and China could take significant measures to curb population growth I don't think that's
not a problem.
I don't find that surprising.
Okay.
Of course, but the specific measures always have to be taken in light of the privacy interests of individuals. But I do think, so to go back to one thing you said, I think it's much better, if it's announced in advance, it seems much, much better, right? So if you say in advance, look, here's the financial structure of what you can expect in terms of help with your children, depending on how many you have, that seems much easier to justify. Now, if it ends up disadvantaging the children, I think there's going to be a worry there.
Okay.
But just in terms of how that makes people, that pushes people towards certain choices, I think that could be justifiable.
Okay. Can I just pull up the secondary? I mean, would it also then, would we be able to hold those octomoms, let's assume that they were, in fact, welfare mothers, account then for making bad choices that put some obligations on the rest of us? I mean, if I'm just utilizing having children as a means of my own substantial, I'm getting that welfare check for every child I've got. I mean, I'm taking it's one way we can change the structure to say you're not going to get that check now at a certain point. But would it then put an obligation, or at least, can we hold them accountable? Can we hold those octomoms accountable? After the
I mean, that touches on a whole different set of issues, but I'm inclined to think society can't make judgments like that. So
No.
we should set up rules in such a way that we can let people make choices within those rules, and it'll come out okay. But we can't start saying, oh, that person is actually using the rules in a way we don't like, so we're going to find some way to retaliate against them. I think that's generally not acceptable.
They do seem to be free riders, right? I mean, they are.
Yeah, we could set up the rules to
to
try to minimize
Yeah.
that problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Got a bit of a queue. Bob, you next. Yes, please use a microphone just so we can record the questions.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, this was a wonderful presentation. It's a very interesting paper. I have two questions, and maybe I'll ask just the first one this time and let it go around and ask the other one later. And this one is just, I just want to get a little bit clearer sort of within your way of thinking about things, or the way of thinking about things that you're driving towards through the end of the paper, about the role that the forced imposition is playing, because sometimes I have it in focus, but then sometimes I find myself wondering that, suppose the facts of life were different and kids just sprouted like mushrooms kind of unpredictably all over the place, right? And for whatever reason, we found more of them sprouting in places like India and China than in Canada here. And wouldn't we still feel, I'm just wondering how that would play out. I mean, wouldn't we still feel that we had perhaps greater duties towards those that were sprouting nearby than those that are sprouting far off? And
Well, maybe, but not for these reasons.
not for these reasons,
Yeah,
right? So
I'm not saying this-
so I'm wondering just to what extent our feeling that we have
Yeah.
these differential duties can really be traced to the fact that it's, given the way the facts of life are, more often than not, it is the result, at least indirectly, of some choice someone's made. I don't know. It's not a very well-formed question.
Yeah. I mean, so I was talking with François before about things that touch on this as well. 'Cause François seems to hold the sprouting theory of human reproduction.
I mean, one sign of that might be, is that, that it doesn't look like we feel that the stringency of the duty, our duty, tracks in any way the real degree of responsibility of the person involved in the reproduction, right? So,
Can I
and you might just say that's a result of the way we balance privacy against. And,
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering.
I mean, clearly it would be crazy to try to track
Yeah.
the degree of
Yeah.
choice. So I think what I need for this argument is something relatively minimal, which is I just need to show that the globalist framework opens the door to imposition of obligations that seems clearly problematic and can't account for that. I think, so whether, what we would say about other cases is, I think these are very difficult questions, but I think as long as the globalist framework is committed to saying that imposition of obligation couldn't possibly make a difference, because the moral arbitrariness argument is always going to win, then I think I can make my case. Do you want to follow
Can I
up on
just
this?
follow up on this? Yeah, but because my sense now, hearing you present it again, is that, so really you want to focus on the problem of obligation and which obligations can be legitimately enforced. You can see that there can be basic welfare interests that are going to that can grant obligations that can be enforced outside the state, but that's really a self-contained realm. And then you have the rest, and then you say you need institutions there for these other kinds of obligations to be enforceable. So that's really the problem, and that's the historical problem that people like you and other people like Simon Kenny in the background are arguing about. I'm just wondering what this idea of unilateral imposition of obligation through at the time of reproduction adds. Why? Because it seems to me that, in fact, that's a distraction. Right? Because you're talking about things like promising, acquisition. These are sort of normative concepts that exist against the background of a normative practice. Right? And that's why we think they allow you to, they're special in the way in which they allowed for the creation of obligations. But having sex, creating people, that's a fact, right? That's a fact that is similar to I shape the life of other people in a way that will lead them to do things that will bring them into contact with other people, which will then, as a result, have obligations towards them because they find themselves to be in those situations, right? So it seems to me, I agree with you with your framing of the latter part of the problem. There is an issue here. When are obligations legitimately enforceable? But I'm not sure that this question of unilaterally imposed obligation at the time of reproduction has anything salient, that adds anything to the debate, really. It collapses, in a way, to any kind of other obligations that we might have, right? If you want to say there's something specific about this, you need to say more, like the work that has been done about promise or about acquisition, to say, here's why these acts are salient, right? And even if you were to demonstrate it,
wait,
right.
I mean, clearly the case is different from promising, and like you couldn't run the argument in terms of promising, right?
Sure.
We couldn't say, oh, people in poor countries, they make promises on our behalf. That's not, the globalists don't think that either.
You analogize them to so the promising doesn't do the same work, but you're saying the choice to create offspring is the same kind of moral behavior, as it were. It's a distinct category that has special implications, which are worth singling out of other obligations that we might generate by other things that we do. And I just don't see that. I don't see why the paper starts there, and you just don't have the second part of the paper, which is their obligations. How do we enforce them? Like the Rawlsian story.
Well, so the hope was, maybe it's just a hope. The hope was to show that there's something implausible about the way we think of the creation of obligation in this context that is worrying for a broader range of views than because I could just run the Kantian story why every obligation has to be reciprocal or something like that, but then people would say, yeah, we've heard that before, and we don't buy that. But so the thought was to show that globalists seem to commit themselves to a normative power that is actually very implausible. So I don't find that the normative powers associated with promising are implausible. I find them fine. I'm not sure it makes a difference whether we think it's a practice or not. You could have a non-practice-based account of promising, and that would still be about normative powers. The same goes for property. I don't know if you have to think it's a practice or something else. It's just about what normative powers we recognize people as having. Now, it's true that having a child is, in a way, just a purely biological fact. But then the question we ask is what normative powers are associated with that biological fact? Globalists postulate very extensive normative powers. And that's what I find questionable.
But do they even have to go there?
So maybe I'm not clear, because I'm granting that there are normative powers associated with having children. But I doubt that the normative powers can go as far as the globalists say without raising problems.
I'm just not even sure why we need to talk about normative powers, period. Right? There are various choices that I make in my life. Are all choices that have implications for others' obligations normative powers on your account? Maybe it's just a question of terminology. I'm just wondering why that one is different. You might say creating the source of obligation is different than impacting obligations through our behavior on others, but what? Why?
Well, so I guess the question is what power, for lack of a better word, do I have to create new obligations for you through my choices? That's the general category of the worry, right? So what choices can I make that will generate new obligations for you? Now, it's true there's a number of ways in which I can do that. A lot of them are not the province of distributive justice, they're the province of the criminal law, right? Like I can create obligations for you by burning down your neighbor's house, and then you have to try to save them and so on. But the thing about reproductive choices is we don't think they're the province of the criminal law. We think that they're permissible choices. We think that people should be entitled to make those choices and all that. But globalists think that there's this quite strong normative power that should be associated with that. And the question is whether it is.
We can move
Yeah.
on. I know there.
Would it help to, I mean, I can see a sense in which it's clearly implausible to say that those who make reproductive choices have the right or the liberty, in the sense that they're justified in creating the obligations that others have towards, say, their offspring. In that sense, you might speak of unjustified normative power. There's still normative power, right? You can still create obligations for others, but it's unjustified.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very different from justified normative power, where we do think we have the right or the liberty to create obligations on third parties.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, part of Francois', I think, is common. I think it's a good one, is that we might have to accept the fact that we do have normative powers to create obligations for others towards our offspring, even though they're not justified. They still give rise, both justified and unjustified uses of normative powers give rise to obligations on third parties. It's just in one case we want to deny the rightness or the liberty or
So what
the
we would be
correctness of
saying, if we put this in the context, would be something like the following. If somebody in a poorer country has a child, they have the justified normative power to create negative moral duties for me, and they have the justified normative power to create positive moral duties for me, and they have the unjustified normative power to create enforceable obligations for me, but these obligations exist, even though the power is unjustified. Is that the thought? Because
I mean, there's about 4 thoughts. I'm not sure I had all of them.
But the thought is, okay, we think some aspects of this normative power are going to be okay, and some aren't. Some are going to be. So we say, okay, when they decide to have a child, they create obligations for me, like imperfect duties. This changes how my imperfect duties generate specific obligations. It could be that I have to help the child or something like that. And let's assume that that's okay. But then there's this other aspect of it, which is they also create enforceable obligations for me. And we think that that's problematic. But then why would our reaction be to say, well, I guess that's just an unjustified normative power, but there it goes again? Why is that what we have to say, rather than, well, if it's unjustified, then the obligation that correlates with it is
I mean,
problematic.
I guess part of it is to capture the perspective of, say, the newborn.
Yeah.
Right. So we might have an objection to my being able to create obligations for you, unwanted obligations or unwelcome obligations on your part towards me. But that's from my perspective. But that seems implausible. I think you're right about that. But if we then take up the newborn who's just born,
Oh, yeah.
and think what kinds of obligations can they expect from not just parents but non-parents as well. And it seems that from their perspective, whether they were created by the justified or unjustified use of a normative power seems irrelevant, morally irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
Whoever can provide what they need, whether it's equality or humanity, I think it works
Yeah.
for both. But from their perspective, it seems that, I mean, they certainly didn't create the obligations unilaterally.
That's true.
They just inherited them. Now, that's not to say that the unjustified use of normative powers is not morally relevant. Right? Of course, it's going to be morally relevant in terms of how you set up political institutions and maybe to deal with population issues. But it seems that both, whether you have a right to create obligations for third parties or not, still obligations can be generated through both the use of justified and unjustified.
Yeah, I mean, I concede that, but my suggestion is that the fact that it's an unjustified use plausibly makes a difference to the content of your obligations. That's the idea.
Whose obligations? The other people vis-a-vis the children?
Yeah, the third party's obligation.
Vis-a-vis the children.
Yes.
I see.
Well, that's the thought, that you would always have these duties of humanitarian aid, because it's not the children's fault if their parents created these obligations for others. So clearly they have all the rights of a human being. But it's still true that you stand in a different relation to them than you do to the children who are born in your society.
Right.
That's the idea.
The question is, I might stand in the same relation to them as to the children which are in my society who were born as a result of unintended pregnancies or as a result of however formulation of that is. I need to see what the choice does to this equation, right? So my obligation towards the children are there because they're children, irrespective of whether the pregnancy was intended or not, right? So what work does the choice to have the children make? What's the difference?
As opposed to just the sprouting of the children?
40% of us here are the result of unintended pregnancies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just saying, and presumably we all have the same obligations towards each other, and on a desert island it would be the same thing.
Yeah. But then I'm tempted to go back to what I said first about Bob's question, which is that I'm not making an empirical claim about how how we relate to specific people in the world, but rather this is a claim about how the globalist framework assumes that obligations can arise. And so long as it's true that they can arise in this way, on this framework, I'm saying it leaves something out. Does that?
Why don't we jump back into the queue? Just
Oh yeah,
let our host,
the people in the room.
Our host, our host needs to do a better job of self-policing. Jake, you're next.
Okay, so,
Microphone. Just.
it's so snazzy over here.
So you could have also the camera on Jake's stuff.
No, that's okay. Okay, so it's a hot summer day, and you and Bob and I go to a pool, a roof deck pool. And it turns out that Bob can't swim, but you, of course, swim very well. And I push Bob in. And let's say I can't swim either. So it seems like I've created an obligation for you.
Yeah.
I've unilaterally created an obligation for you, which is to jump in and save Bob from drowning. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it doesn't really matter whether I've done it intentionally or not. Maybe I accidentally bumped him, or maybe I wanted to save him from the swarm of bees that were coming, and I didn't realize he couldn't swim. Or maybe I'm just a malicious guy and I toss him in. Like, the intention just doesn't matter. I've unilaterally created an obligation for you. Here's a case where there's nothing peculiar about it, right? You said usually I can't create obligations for others, but here's a case where I can. And I think what's going on is, in this case, it's not in virtue of my choice that I created an obligation for you. My choice caused an obligation for you, but the obligation stems from Bob being in need. It doesn't stem from my decision to push him into the water, or my decision to do something else that results in him getting in the water. So it's in virtue of his being in need that you have the obligation, not in virtue of my choice. My choice is just a causal antecedent of that. And so I thought the globalist might be able to respond to you saying the same thing, that when someone has a child, they cause the child to come into being. And then in virtue of the child existing, you have an obligation towards it. Mm-hmm. But you don't have the obligation in virtue of my having caused the child to come into life. It's just a causal antecedent, in the same way that my pushing Bob into the pool is a causal antecedent. So what we, I think I'm repeating myself now, but I think what we get from just reflecting on everyday cases, the principle is that what's problematic is not just any unilateral obligations that you create, but What would be problematic would be creating a unilateral obligation in virtue of your choice. And the globalist is just going to deny that this is a case where you've created a unilateral obligation in virtue of your choice.
Okay, this is helpful. I think this is what Francois was going on
Yeah,
about.
I think it's another way of putting what
Yeah.
both Mike and Francois were trying to get at.
So why would we think that the crucial distinction is whether it's in virtue of your choice or whether it's caused by your choice?
By reflecting on examples like pushing Bob into the pool. So
Yeah.
we think of the normal cases and we think, well, what's going on there? And given how immune it is to my intentions, it
But so-
doesn't seem
so-
to matter how Bob got into the pool. It's right. I think the immunity to my intention is evidence of that.
I'm not sure why we would think that what we need to worry about is people being able to obligate us by virtue of their choice, or people being able to make choices that obligate us. Like, I'm not sure why we would think that we want to draw the line there. I mean, in both cases, they get to obligate us. Isn't that what, like, if we care about avoiding obligations, avoiding unwanted obligations, whether it's just by virtue of your choice or by virtue of pushing on a button that throws Bob in the pool, doesn't seem to make, I'm not sure why that would be the relevant distinction.
Right. I mean, so you could reasonably want to be free of lots of obligations that you're not free of.
Yeah.
Right. But I think the question is whether you have, a right to not be free, or whether
Sure,
you
but
have,
but I'm not sure why that would. That's exactly right, and that's in a way what this comes down to. But
Yeah.
why would that depend on whether it's by virtue of the choice or caused by the choice? I'm not sure. It feels like what we're worried about is the control other people have over your normative situation, and whether the control is directly, whether they can make promises on your behalf or whether they can push Bob into the pool and you're always the only one to save him. I'm not sure that. I mean, in a way that
yeah, I mean,
no, good.
yeah, I mean, so then I'm thinking then the argument seems to kind of become a coordination problem, right? Which is that, there's lots of ways other people can somehow cause obligations or cause problems for me. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure I see that it's just a worry about coordination.
Yeah, maybe that's wrong.
Yeah.
We've got Stephen, and then Michael, and
There's John.
Hello, Professor Hodgson. I enjoyed your paper.
Thank you.
There were a lot of very interesting points. I have 3 questions here. I'll ask one of them, and I've made a sort of a consideration of my own that you can think of here. If this deals with setting up the transnational infrastructure of what could possibly constitute those institutions. If a wealthy nation or a coalition of powerful nations were to form a coercive alliance against a league of developing countries which would usurp the egalitarian institutions in order to force the weaker member states to submit to their superior will, this would clearly undermine the reciprocal nature of procedural justice that you discuss in your paper. Do you think that a transnational court of justice, which would seek impartiality by having justices serve fixed terms from all countries, with none of them having a veto power over any other member, really be sufficient to fairly arbitrate between disputants who possess vastly unequal degrees of wealth and influence? If this institution fails, would you advocate for some type of transnational military option which would be similar to a coalition created under the auspices of the United Nations?
So, sorry, I missed the last part because I was so.
Oh, okay, I'll read it
so-
again.
No, I think I agreed with the problem, but what was the solution? What do we have under the auspices of the United Nations?
What I was saying is if there is, if a military type of transnational military option maybe would be required if, say, some wealthy nations go too far and they don't allow this transnational order to operate, sort of like an obstruction of justice.
Oh, I see.
Would you advocate that there should be first a military option, sort of like a coalition created by the United Nations?
I mean, I doubt that the worries I'm expressing here would ever justify military intervention. So I'm inclined to say no.
I wouldn't think
I'm not saying
so.
that military intervention is
No.
never justified for anything, but I don't think it could be a justifiable way to implement reproductive justice. It would be a drastic way to control population, but I don't think it's
Well, what
acceptable.
I should have written more on is I was thinking of a world that became very overpopulated, and there were very few resources, say because of global warming, say of hundreds of millions of environmental migrants moving into certain ideas, and there was just, there were wars going on already, say, between different nations that have a lot of weapons over water rights, say. I should have written that. I just didn't have enough room, and I was thinking.
But again,
in that
I want to say
case-
I'm not opposed to military intervention in all cases, and if you start making the scenario dire enough, then it's going to look like military intervention may be justified. But just in terms of what I'm saying here, I don't think it could ever be justified.
What about a court of justice? Like I was saying, having a court system set up to arbitrate, that would hopefully be effective.
I like that. Yeah. I think we should have more such institutions and more effective ones.
I mean, I kind of I thought somewhat along the same lines. I was thinking, why would the international institutions need to be similar in kind, having the same enforcement power as state institutions? Because toward the end of the paper, you said that these international institutions, there's good reasons for having them and trying to develop them. And your second claim, they ought to look like state institutions that could enforce obligations. I'm a bit worried about those kinds of international institutions in some respects. I mean, one, it doesn't consider the alternative, which is thinking about international institutions which serve the purely informative or coordinated function, right? They can just, suppose you could have an international institution which had no enforcement capacity or resources, but it specialized in determining which particular states owed duties of retributive justice towards other states. And why could, I mean, that's it's non-state-like, but it still could be an international institution that served a very important function, just in terms of, here's the information. It serves an epistemic function, just determining what the obligations were, and then left it up to states whether or not to follow their obligations or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have I think that might be okay, as long as the institution is set up to be responsive to the interests of everyone. So as long as it's not just.
So it couldn't look like the Security Council.
No, it could not look like the Security Council.
But nonetheless, it wouldn't
But
have
then
to have
how it
enforcement.
actually implements its policies, that could go through the states.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Right. The states would be the enforcement organs, or,
Right.
a la Kelsen.
Yeah,
But the international institutions themselves would need to be coercive.
yeah, no, I think that would be okay.
On point, can I just?
Are you on?
Yeah, on point, yeah, sorry. This one, yeah, sorry. Why do they have to be political? Why can't they be market-based? I mean, it seems as though if we match it onto the market in some sort of ideal form at least, we can have a market-based approach at the international level that uses reciprocity or principles of reciprocity. And it seems like we might be able to get that off the ground a little better. I don't know why they have to be politically based at all, for that matter.
I'm not sure I see how markets.
I mean, markets are political.
Well, they are
But
political, but
I'm
they're
also
not
not
political
sure
in
how
the-
I see how
in the
they
policies sort of.
ensure reciprocity in any way.
Well, if we can say that we have market relations within the actual international level, then we can at least get some sort of basis for But maybe I'm off on that, but I don't
So,
know.
but what would that
Just-
mean? Like you would auction off the right to have children or something like that?
No, I don't think.
Carbon credits almost, right? Like birth credits.
No, I don't think it's to that degree. But I'd have to think about it.
I mean, I need
Yeah.
a more specific
Yeah.
idea
Yeah.
of how the markets would help. So my sense is that markets, they're good for some things, but they're rarely good for justice and reciprocity and making sure everybody's interests are taken into account and all that. I don't see that as their forte.
Okay, we've still got quite a bit of the queue to go. So Michael, you're next. And then
Hi, thanks for coming up, Professor. Just like one remark there, I think one of the issues when we're dealing with the choice issues, whatnot, is that, and you've touched on it when the idea of reproductive privacy, is that there's something different about childbirth in that, in many ways, it acquires almost like a human right, right? Like people have the right to have kids, and that is a very common kind of refrain. I think the strength of what I found in your argument that touched on other issues is that there's something about childbirth which brings these things to the forefront. Because for other things, you could argue, well, states and populations are liable for what they want. They make decisions. Politicians make decisions. They gotta live with it, right? Whereas with birth, there's something else about it in terms of creating obligations. So I think there's something there that you might want to bring some other people in, because I thought that was a very powerful way to kind of bring these ideas to the forefront. So that's a remark. The one thing I'm mentioning about, I think the institutions already got touched on in terms of like how we would actually share the obligations, the UN veto drama you might see if it was a more coercive institution. But I thought it might be interesting to bring into, and I don't know if you might want to talk about this, is we talk about costs, obligations on others created by childbirth from other countries. And to be evil for the pool example, like you could say, well, you know what? That person there, if you pushed that guy into the pool, I could be like, you know what? I didn't create that. I'm not doing it, right? So, I mean, that could be one approach from a state is, I don't owe you a duty. You did it. It's your problem. That's one way to approach it. The other one is, instead of just obligations, what about the benefits, You bring people into the world, well, they could work, they could teach, they could have other kids, they could make the world a better place. So, like maybe that's also importance of having institutions, that they'd manage not just obligations of other states, but the benefits. Okay, you're having a lot of kids, you'll have a lot of tax dollars, so that should, come over here too. So I don't know if you want to think about that or talk about it. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, so the cost-benefit thing, I think that, so that touches on the I don't know if you're in the seminar, but the Also Ready piece makes a lot about that. But the thing about that Also Ready's discussion, which I think is very interesting, is that it's all at the domestic level, right? And it's all about how within a society you can make children into what you call socialized good, which is sort of you make them into, they're not public goods, but you make them into something like a public good. But of course, this doesn't happen across borders. And so the thought would be, within my society, if things have been set up well, it's true that one of the reasons why I can't complain if we put in place a subsidized daycare program, and I have to pay for the children of others through my taxes, is that, well, this is done for the good of society, and this is part of the, they bring benefits as well as costs and all that. But on the globalist picture, I take it, there is this idea that if you add another kid in a poor country, that's just a net cost for me. They're certainly not committed to the idea that it's going to come back to me in some kind of benefit.
Then
Their view doesn't depend on that.
Yeah, then they probably should then. It's like you can't just, because even in a local community, you can't just have kids and expect, oh yeah, they'll take up the slack. There's still an expectation you're gonna have to take care of the kids. So you're sharing the pleasure, but you should also share the pain, right? And maybe in a global society, and I don't know if maybe in an alternative, instead of having global institutions like states, having something else that could still do the same thing. I don't know if that's even like theoretically possible, but I thought that was very interesting in terms of the state analogy and global analogy there. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think if we got to the point where internationally as well, there's this idea that there are costs but also benefits associated to any child anywhere because they're part of a great system that works to everybody's advantage, then that would be different. Thanks.
John, you next.
As it happens, my remarks kind of follow really closely on the discussion you've just been having. That I was trying to think of an example, like a nice domestic one where there's lots of practice, where we can test the theories against a big body of practice. And the one that came to mind was, where giving birth to a child results in obligations on third parties. Is very like your daycare example, except it's been around much longer, which is basically the basic right to at least a limited extent to an education for every child, right? And most of that is paid for through municipal taxation, right? Where all kinds of people who have no children are obliged to pay taxes, and that's the typical way of imposing obligations on third parties, is to have a system of taxation, right? So you tick off whether you're a public school board or separate school board, and this is how complicated it gets in our locality, and it's sort of the school boards are limited in territory even within the province of Ontario, and people argue for the level of taxation, and you can mix in the private sector because people can opt out and pay for education at the elementary and secondary levels, and likewise the debate that's coming on with the new bill introduced this week, First Nations communities, where one of the reasons why that system of education is inadequate is because there's very little local taxation in First Nations communities. So, this just as a practical body of practice, this is how complicated it gets even within Ontario in terms of figuring out how you're going to oblige third parties to pay for something to which children are entitled, right? Now, getting onto your paper, right? If I was critiquing the paper in writing, I'd make two lists. Every time you use the word we in something like we decide, or we can do this, or we could do that. And the second one was every time you use the passive voice, saying this could be done or that could be done. And the problem with both of those practices is you're not specifying the relevant community. But you're talking about the larger issue of, and really the fundamental problem is to what extent there really is a global community. and it's pretty fantastic to say that there is one. The global institutions are so primitive at the present moment, right, that the talk of obligations is largely premature.
Yeah. Well, that would be going further than I want to go, but I think that for these purposes, communities are constituted by the institutions. And so it's not like the relevant community, when you think of how we obligate each other, isn't, your neighborhood in Toronto. It's the city, and then the province, and the federal level, and so on. So the institutions constitute the relevant communities that we have to think about. And so whether there's a global community depends, as you said, on the strength of the global institutions, which is not tremendous. Yeah. Yeah.
Carolina?
Okay, so I have two questions. They're both brief. So first of all, I'm interested in understanding why you are framing the discussion, or why you're approaching the debate between the statists and the globalists in the way that you are. So why focus on the moral arbitrariness of birthplace rather than, say, the moral arbitrariness of state borders? So the idea that the richer countries of the world have redistributive duties to poorer states precisely because, the state borders that exist are historically contingent, or the product of colonialist exploitation, or otherwise, they exist for reasons that we wouldn't want to accord, normative weight to. And then my other question is, you mentioned that you want to move away, towards the end of your paper, you want to move away from this tendency to regard institutions as tools or as instruments, which is something that Caney does. But I'm curious as to, well, I guess I'd like to know how exactly you see your account as not falling prey to that kind of that habit or that tendency, because you mentioned that you're not interested in the precise policies or the reproductive policies that are enacted by states. You're just interested in ensuring that everyone's interests are sort of responded to. But isn't that sort of just the very same tendency of regarding like institutions as tools, because you're sort of identifying that there's this goal that you'd like to achieve, sort of responsiveness to the interests of everyone, and then and then you're saying after that we need to implement these institutions so that we can ensure that goal. So I'm not sure, I'm not clear on how that's different than what someone like Caney would propose.
Well, so I think on the second question, so it's true that I'm very imprecise when I talk about institutions, but that makes me irresponsible. That doesn't make me an instrumentalist, right? So I think what makes me not an instrumentalist is that I don't think that the content of the obligations is fixed independently of the existence of the institutions. Caney thinks that. He thinks the obligations are just fixed by the moral order, if you will, and then we put in place institutions that will satisfy these obligations. Whereas I think if you share institutions with people, that can make a difference to the obligations you have towards them. So that's what goes beyond instrumentalism. On the first question, I'm inclined to think, maybe I haven't thought about this hard enough, but I'm inclined to think that the worry about the moral arbitrariness of birthplace is the same worry as the worry about the moral arbitrariness of borders. That is, birthplace matters because there are borders and because they prevent people from moving around and so on. At least that seems to be the main thing that makes birthplace significant. If we open up all borders, the worry would mostly, or at least largely, be addressed. But if we say, you brought up worries about colonialist exploitation, that is a separate worry from anything I say here, right? So if we worry about colonialist exploitation, that may justify all sorts of measures that wouldn't otherwise be justified. But that adds more to the discussion, right? So I'm just interested in showing that you can't just start with the idea that borders are morally arbitrary and from that jump to conclusions about our obligations of distributive justice. That step is not as easy to take as globalists suggest. How easy is the step from these borders are not just morally arbitrary, they're actually morally reprehensible, and they're the fruit of colonial wars and so on. How you can get to that two conclusions is another very difficult question.
Okay, next is Bob.
Bob number 2.
This is a different kind of question. I just wanted to hear a bit more, go back to the Rawlsian solution to the problem, and just hear a little bit more about why that's not good enough. I just find the globalist response so lame. I mean, it's true that from the point of view of the two kids, it's always going to seem morally arbitrary, right? It's morally arbitrary that they're born into the two different countries. It's morally arbitrary that the countries have these different histories, so on and so forth. But why should we think that the only one who has, the only persons here who can offer reasons that we have to take seriously are the two kids? I mean, why can't we think of the local communities? And the one says, look, it's reasonable for us to expect our kids to be taken care of to a certain level because we have made these choices in the past and we are, as a result, richer and so forth. So there's this way of focusing just on the comparison of that, which seems kind of bizarrely.
Well,
it seems lame to me.
I agree, and I find Rawls's argument persuasive. Maybe that's a reason not to.
Well, that's the worry then, right? If it's good enough.
Well, if it's so, the worry about Rawls's argument is not that it's not good enough; it's that it doesn't address the other point of view enough. That would be the worry, that it.
That it doesn't address which, I guess.
The globalist point of view.
Right.
So globalists don't find it convincing because they say, well, that's still a morally arbitrary fact.
Right, but then can't we just say to them, well, that's because you're just focusing on the claims that the two kids can make and not the claims that their parents and neighbors and fellow citizens and so forth can make, right? I mean, it's true if you just compare, if you think of just the two kids sitting around the table and they each have these, it's arbitrary, but they're not the only, why should they be the only two people at the table when we're trying to figure out what's reasonably rejectable or whatever?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm inclined to agree, but that's just saying that there are many good arguments in favor of statism, right?
Yeah, which would be okay.
Or at least that, yeah. I mean, it's not like Rawls's argument comprises my argument or something. I feel like it's a different argument, right? But it does the same thing, which is to try to show that there are other things that you have to take into consideration. And my hope was that the things I point to are things that are harder. Once you see them, they're harder to ignore.
Okay.
That's yeah.
Justin?
Hi. My question is relating to the actual allocation of aid resources. I think that if we agree that we have a stronger duty or obligation to ensure the equitable life prospects of a Canadian baby over a baby from another country, I still think that if we know the life prospects of the different babies, say, one from Polynesia or something, we know that for them it's a matter of life and death receiving the aid, but for the Canadian baby it's a matter of poverty or wealth. The inclination is still to give our aid to the foreign country. So in that respect, the basic humanitarian aid that you say is still owed to a foreign nation actually trumps our duty to provide the equitable life prospects of our compatriots. Would you agree?
Yeah.
So if we have limited resources, then our duty is still first and foremost to give that money to a foreign country before our own.
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay.
I mean, the claim is just, the claim is only that it's plausible to think that there are different, more stringent duties that apply domestically than at the international level. But it's not a claim about the priority of the various duties.
But if the duty at the national level is more stringent, it seems to have no impact in application, because we're still giving our money first to the foreign nation.
Well, by stringent, I don't mean, maybe that's the wrong word to use, but I don't mean that it has priority over the other duty. I mean it's a duty that it doesn't run out the way the other one does. It demands more of you. That is, if you've ensured that all the children in the world have reached a decent minimum, then you've done all you had to do as far as distributive justice is concerned. Whereas within the society, the demands are much greater. So it's more stringent in that sense.
I see.
But it doesn't mean that it's a stronger or that it has priority over the other.
Okay, Madame?
I have a question about, right. So I'm imagining, since you gave the Ulster-Ready reading last week, that you would believe that the economic cost-benefit argument could be used for a globalized, within a globalized framework. Is that right? Would that be correct?
Not necessarily. I don't know how much I actually agree with the argument.
Yeah?
In
Okay.
the end.
Because I was hoping to ask how that would work exactly.
Yeah.
Because partly it seems like that reading kind of articulates that economics can be used to provide
what, sorry?
that the economic cost-benefit argument could be used to articulate an obligation for positive benefit. So because we derive benefit from, let's say, a child being born somewhere else, that we would have a reciprocal obligation to provide. And I was wondering if, that is plausible, could that not undermine the idea that there should be an equal benefit? Because could it not be that some children could be seen to be more valuable than others in a given context?
Yeah, I don't think that it's an acceptable way to design political institutions to ask, what benefit each children is likely to bring, and to say that their entitlements depend on that. I don't think that's remotely justifiable. The way in which the cost-benefit analysis would be relevant, but I'm not sure how much I want to put it in these terms, is that the idea would be that we want institutions that can take into account the costs and benefits of children and ensure that the costs are spread in a way that's fair to society, given the benefits that we can expect. And that also ensures that we keep the birth rate in a range that ensures that the benefits continues. So we would need something like that at the international level. But I think, I suspect that also Reddy's analysis would suggest that obligations could kick in all sorts of other ways that I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure they would.
Okay, cool. I was just curious about that. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks. All right. Anthony?
Yes, microphone.
Right, so I had a question about the connection between the problem of unilateral imposition of obligations by reproductive choices and the nature of the solution to it. So, so bracketing issues about how it translates into like the international system. So I take it that the solution is just like the Kantian argument for political authority. We should set up a state for the reasons that Kant says. So, but the problem is, and this might be because I don't fully understand the Kantian position, but the problem is that the obligations imposed by reproductive choices are essentially positive obligations on your view. So they're more like the duty to rescue the climber that gets stuck, rather than the duty to not kill people. So this is like exactly why the Lockean proviso doesn't solve it, because having a child is essentially costly. But the Kantian argument for political authority, at least as I understand it, it takes off from the problem of unilateral acquisition of property. That imposes only negative obligations, though. And so the entire argument is, like the edifice is built on this foundation of negative obligations. So acquisition of property it seems to me unlike having a child, which imposes positive obligations. And the reason why it's a problem is because it imposes positive obligations. So I'm wondering if there's a disconnect between the problem and the solution.
Well, I would think, again, I could say the argument is, in a way, there's even more of a problem, right, with the claim that we create positive obligations for others than there is with acquisition on this analysis. And so, if we need the state for acquisition, then a fortiori we need the state for these other obligations to kick in. Now maybe you would think, oh, but the Kantian state isn't enough. We need even more than that in this case.
So you're saying you could still run the Kantian argument. In fact, the Kantian argument is even stronger if the problem of, let's say, the problem of acquiring property actually imposed positive obligations.
Well, I would think if you say the Kantian argument is just worried about creating these negative obligations for others, and that demands the state to make it okay, well, then if it has something to say about positive obligations, it's either going to say the same thing and say it doesn't matter, it's the form of the obligation, not whether it imposes costs or anything like that. Or it's going to say we need even more than we needed for these obligations. But either way, that's not going to pull you back towards the globalist position. It's going to, I think it's going to just push you further in the status camp.
Okay.
I think.
Right.
Okay, why don't you join me in thanking Professor Hodgson?
Oh, thank you for these great questions.